study in Foscari University, Venice. It is the last university where I published something. It is there in your university. I have a lot of colleagues there in architecture, not here, but it is a pleasure to meet you here and in research and publish about this subject, of course. So I'm very curious and very interested to listen to you. So, Professor, the floor is yours.
Hello. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. Yes, I confirm I'm Fabrizio Panozzo from Foscari University, Venice, and I have the pleasure today to use my time to take you through my own experience and my professional experience as a researcher and professor in the field of culture and creative industries, with a background on nonprofit and social organizations, which can form my intellectual mix and lead me to the considerations that I would like to share with you. I've also been in the last few years, in the last couple of years, deeply involved in an Interact Med projects financed by the Med program. So I'm also a user of the program. So some of the considerations that we share with you are also coming from, and the examples that we make are also coming from a project that has been completed a few months ago. So I'll use my screen. I hope everything is visible. Please confirm if everything is visible. I will project. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so off I go. I will take you through my current reflections. I'm sharing with you also my research reflections. So I've been working in the last few months and publishing as well, or at least presenting at conferences, a few reflections on a couple of decades of policies devoted to culture and creativity. So this is why my title is not so provocatively, the title of my talk is After CCI. What do we do after CCI? And what do we mean after CCI? So I will spend the first slide explaining, taking a step backwards and going back to when CCIs emerged and taking you through the reasons for me, which were the reasons for which CCIs have been supported, and what are the reasons now and in the future to pay attention to culture and creativity, maybe outside of an acronym that qualifies them as industries. And this outside of a set, outside of a sector, is what I call the ubiquity of culture and creativity. So this is the claim, this is the message I want to give. This is the signal, that this is what I want to signal, that probably in the future, in the coming future, in the next few months, we need to think about culture and creativity in another way, which is more ubiquitous. In order to make my point, I start from the beginning. The beginning is not so old. The beginning, we have to go back to the last decade of the 20th century, in which CCI's culture and creative industries were invented. So we need to remember this beginning of CCI. CCIs were not the result of a carefully designed quadruple helix. They were not the result of joint reflection between civil society, academia, businesses, and government. They were a governmental invention. So they were invented by a government, the UK government, in a very specific time, in a very specific place, in the second half of the 90s, in the 20th century, in order to tackle a very specific problem that had to do with what we are discussing today. Today, we are discussing industrial transformation. CCIs, we always have to remember, they were invented because of industrial transformation, because in the UK, at that time, the government felt that the mode of capitalist production of the UK, which was the mode of capitalist production of Europe at the time, was changing, had been changing for the last couple of decades, but governments had been not so quick in reacting to that change, or maybe didn't have find a way to react to that change, because basically the manufacturing-based model, the model that granted the development of Europe in the 20th century was not there anymore. It was crumbling. We were facing globalization, and manufacturing was moving to places where labor is cheaper, to put it simply. And governments needed a new idea. They needed a new way of making sense of their economy, of their society. And culture and creativity, they provided an ideal answer at the time. So there was a decline in labor-intensive manufacturing, but at the same time, there was a recognition that another type of economy was emerging, a knowledge-intensive economy. So how do we call it? We tried to call it for a while knowledge economy, but culture and creative industry, I think, created a more effective label, definitely a more effective label, because they qualified something that existed, but they sort of put a spotlight, a light on culture and creativity as a sector. This action, this political action, which I stress is a political action, it is the invention, it's an act of creativity by a government, had a number of consequences, because it also captured the fact that the economy was changing according to a knowledge base, but then also we saw the emergence of the greater economic relevance of the category of the symbolic, the social, the emotional. We recognize all these categories, the symbolic, the social, the emotional, they used to be outside of the economic. So being social meant not being economic, being emotional meant not being rational, being symbolic meaning not being real. All these aspects have now been absorbed, and they started to be absorbed into the economic, the competitive, the managerial. Think about the social. The social in the 20th century it was used as a category to separate from the economic. What is social is not economic. With the invention of Facebook, the social network, the network becoming social became a product. It is now one of the massive generators of wealth, is something called social, in which you exchange emotions and you find friends. So all these aspects that used to be outside the economic, they've been captured into the economic. So this is why also this is the channel through which culture and creativity, which used to be thought as outside the economic, they got embedded into a sector. So embedding into a sector was the original choice that was made by policymakers. And I argue that this embedding of this closing, that this packaging of culture and creativity into a sector has had so far very positive consequences, very positive outcomes, but has been starting to be more a problem than a solution, and we surely have to be abandoned, as we've already seen, will have to be abandoned in the coming months, and I explain why. So my question is, again, not so provocative. Do we still need CCIs? Sorry. And when I ask the question, I don't mean, do we need culture and creativity? What I mean is, do we need a box in which we place culture and creativity, and upon which we devote policies, resources, support, and governmental help? The feeling I have is that we've needed it for the last decades. We don't need it anymore in the future, and we have to learn to get rid of the boxing of culture and creativity. The identification, the isolation of culture and creativity in a sector, in an industry, has been useful, as we've seen also right now in the examples. It has been useful to create visibility, to celebrate relevance, and to attract interests and funds. So we had to do it in a way, politically, socially. We had to sort of switch on this spotlight, to illuminate culture and creativity, to affirm politically that culture and creativity were relevant, and to devote resources to culture and creativity. And in order to do so, we had to box them. We had to put them together into a box and make something with that population of enterprises and people within the box. But the mechanism of identification, the mechanism of isolation has also a dark side in a way. When we identify, when we isolate, we risk to degenerate into other mechanisms: defensiveness, closure, stereotypes, all the mechanisms that we use to maintain the boundary, to maintain a presumption of difference, a presumption of distinctiveness. Either it is natural, either this distinctiveness is out there in real life, but if we have to maintain it politically, if we have to maintain it administratively, it starts to become kind of stiff, rigid, a bit bureaucratic. We use words more than practices, and we carefully craft phrases in order to explain why those typologies should be kept together. And there's a risk there, because as reality changes, as real economic and social life evolves, then these categories, they have to adapt. And if those categories are not needed anymore in the form of a box, we need to learn how to make sense of them. So my question again, do we need to keep culture and creativity in their own box in order to respond to the challenges of industrial transformation? My answer is no. My answer is that we have to think of something else. We have to think literally, bring those out of the box. And how do we do that? How do we bring culture and creativity out of the administrative and political and statistical box in which we've placed them for very useful reasons? We should, I think, position culture and creativity within industrial transformation rather than on a side, rather than thinking of culture and creativity as one of the many actors of industrial transformation. We should see culture and creativity as an integral part of the ways in which all the other organizations, all the other businesses, all the other elements and components of society function. And this comes, and here comes an example from the Interreg project that I've managed, in which we've tried to use art. We didn't speak in this case of culture and creativity, so explicitly we use art as the ultimate condensation of culture and creativity. And we've been working on the role of the artist. And in this project, we came up with the idea of artist residencies in business environment. This has been our attempt. This has been our way of exemplifying what I've just said, to move culture and creativity away from a sector and bringing them in close connection with business environments. So we proposed this idea of the artistic residencies. Why residencies? Because we wanted to stress the importance of interaction. We wanted to stress the importance of some idea of intimacy, of intimate relationship, not an episode, but a longer extent of time in which artists could inhabit the environment of industrial transformation. They could stay, they could live, they could interact, they could talk, they could have lunch together with people in a more industrial business environment. And we multiplied these examples across the Mediterranean, because again, it was financed by the Interreg Med program. We multiplied these examples of artists having the opportunity to imagine solutions, or even just think about problems together with managers as entrepreneurs. We stress here the importance of space and time. Interaction has to be spatial, it has to happen in physical places, and it has to be extended, and it has to have time available to evolve, to play out in different ways according to the inventions or to the exchanges that the protagonists put in place. We think that with these and other examples, we've not been the only one to experiment with artistic residencies, but we think that art placed in contexts reveals its transformative potential. So here, culture and creativity summarized in the notion of art and in the role of the artist, we've tried to stress how art can transform. And in its transformative potential, it can accompany, reinterpret, suggest something new also to industrial transformation. But this transformative potential of the arts resides also in the capability of eliciting, of identifying, of making visible the cultural and the creative dimension of industry itself, of the non-officially cultural and creative industries themselves. In making these experiments, in conducting this project, one of the main results was the blurring of the boundaries between the creative, the cultural, and the industrial. The more artists interacted with managers as entrepreneurs, the less the difference was visible. The more you bring interaction into the practice, the doing of things, the more you see that culture and creativity are an asset that exists in every organization, but we have to find a way to make it visible and to celebrate it in every organization rather than having it in a box. I don't know where I'm taking too much time, so I try to speed up a bit. I think that as a consequence also of the more general considerations I've made, and more specific consideration I've made based on my own experience, I think that there's a challenge now for CCIs, and it is the challenge that I named the challenge of ubiquity, the challenge of being everywhere. After a couple of decades, I think, spent in a kind of protected environment, we use for CCIs very often the notion of the incubator. So the incubator is fine, but you know, incubating a life has always a dimension of protection on one side, but also a danger. You incubate a life that is in danger. So the question is, are CCIs in danger still? Do we need still to protect them? Or should we treat them like adults? I think the time has come to treat culture and creativity as adults rather than as life in danger, protected species to be placed in a kind of secluded environment in which they can flourish, protected from the threats of the environment. And how do we do that? How do we treat culture and creativity as adults? I think we do that by considering, interpreting culture and creativity more as a transversal phenomenon than a profession. Culture and creativity is not only something that you attach to your business card or that you write on a plate outside your office. Culture and creativity, they belong to society. They are used every day by everyone in every type of organization. Yes, of course, they are also a profession, but they can no longer be just a profession in a sector. So we should, I think, acknowledge the ubiquitous nature of culture and creativity, which means acknowledging the fact that they are everywhere. How do we do that? How do we start getting used to this idea that culture and creativity is everywhere? Well, one move, for instance, is refrain from the stereotyping of the creative. The creative is not, as shouldn't, I think, be blocked and framed, both the creative as a category and the creative as a person, into the stereotyping of the creating of the culture as young, visionary, smart, why not, uncanny, colorful, weird. We've heard a lot in the last couple of decades. We've characterized, and I think we've stereotyped by now, the creative into this world of the color, of the crazy hair, of the funny way of speaking. It is the time again to become adult and to look at the creative dimension, not so much as a kind of funny category, weird category of the economy, but as something that fertilizes the society. So I think we should think into the boxes rather than out. We should bring culture into the boxes, and the boxes being the major drivers of transformation that we encounter and were presented to us before as well. So sustainability, innovation, internationalization, technology, biodiversity, tourism, these are the boxes in which culture and creativity should be placed rather than being a box itself. So I think this is the challenge of ubiquity, to think into the box, and the box is being the rest of society, the society, and the challenges that society faces. My two final slides are a quick explanation of the ubiquity of creativity. Creativity is not, again, as I said, a specialistic knowledge owned by some. Creativity is owned by everyone, but it has to be seen as an essential component of economic and social transformation. Creativity in that sense, again, is not a professional characteristic, is a constant, is the attitude to constant change, to constant challenging the current state of things. And for instance, entrepreneurship is a quintessential creative act. When you become an entrepreneur, you challenge something, you defy a status quo. You are unhappy and frustrated with something, and you want to start up your own because you can't find a box, you can't find a space. And what do you do when you do that? You act creatively, you invent something new. We should recognize that creative dimension in entrepreneurship, and not only when entrepreneurship is digital or fancy or comes in the form of a technological startup, but any kind of entrepreneurship. We should move from stereotypes, the one that characterize in a sort of very visible, very strong distinction between creative and industrial, and move to oxymorons, accept oxymorons. We should talk of industrial creativity, and why not? We should imagine creative bureaucracy or creative engineering. We should get used, I think, to this way of speaking in which creativity is mixed and challenges. Think about creative bureaucracy. I guess we find it hard to even think of creative bureaucracy, but we should, because we should challenge governments to be creative in the way in which they are bureaucratic. Finally, the ubiquity of culture. Again, culture is everywhere. Think about industrial transformation. How do we learn about industrial transformation? We don't learn about industrial transformation looking at the way in which industry is transformed. We learn about industrial transformation as kids in school, during the history classes, when we are told that at the beginning of the 19th century, something happened, history changed, and we call that industrial revolution. But that is part of history. It's the history professor that tells us about industrial transformation in the first place. And it happens when we are 8 years old. So this is where we learn as very young pupils that industrial transformation is cultural. And we should tap into that. We should tap into the cultural roots of industrial transformation. So the transformation of how we produce what we are, what we use, and how we work is deeply cultural. And we should look at this cultural dimension of industrial change. Because industrial organizations, they are cultures, and we should look at them as cultures. They are cultures to the extent that they put together humans, techniques, knowledge in time and space. So we should look at enterprises as cultures. We should look at businesses as culture. We should use culture to interpret the way in which industries are being transformed and the way in which organizations change. Another element of culture, which is already, doesn't need to be brought in, is already in industry, is the theme and the topic of heritage. organizations, they maintain layers, they maintain the memory of the past transformation. Many industrial organizations, they have museums, and increasingly, at least in this part of the world, organization and industrial organizations, they are interested in preserving their memory. The more they are pulled into the future, the more they desire to preserve their past and their heritage, because the heritage is what links them to a territory, to a society in which they've grown up. So to conclude, the transformation of industry must be seen in connection with the transformation of places and people, because this is what make industrial transformation truly cultural and creative. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I was looking for my mouse. It doesn't obey me, so this is why it takes so long to. Thank you very much. Let me say, Professor, let me say a couple of words about what you're saying. Two things. The first one, I don't recognize that as a provocative presentation, but a quite challenging one. You agree with me? At least it's challenging.
Yes,
I think.
Let's say challenging.
Yeah, I like the words. Yeah, challenging. Well, let me because we are of course accepting questions if there is any. But as usual, I have one. During many years, because I'm finishing my career, but during many years I was professor a little bit around the world. And the interesting question, when you remember us, how it started, the idea of CCI, and by the way, in the statistic of international trade, it gave the British an opportunity to write down the statistic. It's a kind of substitution, as you said, a substitution of industrial that they want to change or make it disappear or challenge, or threatening to disappear. But the interesting part is, I was professor in China and in Canada and in Africa, South America, and so on. And the interesting part is, do you risk with this challenging to have a speech for Europe and United States, but it doesn't fit with the situation in Asia or in Africa or South America? Don't you risk to have this? And this is something I don't know if you understood.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Don't you risk to have this this challenging for Europeans and not for in Africa, where you spend 0.00 I don't know what in culture or creativity and so on?
This was my reflection was strictly European. So I was looking at the way in which policies for CCIs have developed within Europe. My view, also as a professor of cultural policy, is that everywhere, depending on the dynamics of development, you need to have a period of time in which you isolate culture and creativity and you do policies for them. Okay. It happened in Europe. It happened in the UK, and then it was transferred to continental Europe, and it went through a phase. And my feeling is that the phase is now not over, the phase is being transformed. There was a phase of identification, isolations, and policies. But we've seen before, from the presentation of the new priorities and modalities of the MED program, that things are changing, that culture and creativity is asked to be ubiquitous, as I say. And this has been a positive result of 20 years or 20 more years of policies devoted to the sector. So you need them. You will need them in Africa. You will need them in South Asia when they are needed.
Yeah, I asked that because still we have a lot of students coming from these countries to Europe, and they are a little bit shocked with this these new approaches, and this is why I want to put this question. But I have two questions for you.
Yes.
The first one is the look and feel of products are jobs of creators, and the development of how the products work are the job of engineers. The question is whether the engineers are indeed creators and that they add creativity to engineering of a product.
Gosh, this is difficult.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah, can you ask me the second?
Yeah, I
no, that's okay.
The question? Okay. You want to repeat the question? Yeah?
No, I can see your point.
Okay. It's not me. It's a person from the public. Okay.
That's from the public.
Yeah. The next questions is from the public. Okay.
Okay. On this first one, I must admit that as an organizational scholar, spending time within organizations, looking at the way in which designers and engineers interact, they do not respond to that classification. In reality, engineers and designers, they do not fit into the academic distinction of what they should do. They do. And when they do things in context, the boundaries between their function, they blur. And when the project is successful, it is because the boundaries have been blurring between formalized categories. This is part of what I want to say. I know that in order to speak, in order to say things academically and politically, we have to box and we have to attribute meaning to definitions. But then we also have to be aware that people out there in businesses, in real life, they constantly blur and contest the boundaries that we define, especially the boundary between making something function and making something beautiful. You mentioned the Bauhaus at the beginning. The Bauhaus is the quintessential expression of the fusion between functionality and design. No one at the Bauhaus was worried about asking, are you an engineer or are you a designer? The challenge was to be both at the same time. Not surprisingly, this is what the European Commission wants from us now. They want us to be inspired by this mixing that originally was conceived in the Bauhaus.
Yeah, thank you. This is why I like Bauhaus, by the way. Yes. And nobody has to Kandinsky if he was a painter or an engineer, right? Yes. Yeah, okay. I have another question from the public, and it goes like that. The question is, CCI could create a dimension of job connectivity in an industrial transformation context in order to improve resilience of employment strategies and then of SME.
If CCIs could do that?
Yeah. CCI could create, this is a question, huh?
Okay.
A long one, but this is CCI could create a dimension of job connectivity in an industrial transformation context in order to improve resilience of employment strategies and then of CMEs?
Culture and creativity could. Not CCIs as a sector, but culture and creativity as a process, as an attitude. I think that the answer would be yes if we replace CCIs as a sector to culture and creativity as a practice. So yes, culture, for instance, the cultural analysis and the cultural reflections and the cultural practices within organizations, they can make organizations more resilient, for sure. I know it personally, because I'm conducting cultural analysis and I'm bringing cultural activities and processes within organizations, and they become more flexible and more resilient. So the answer is yes.
Okay, thank you. And the last one I have here for you, Professor, from the public still. What policymakers can do to contribute to this process of overcoming the boundaries and help culture and creativity to reveal its transformation potential?
Ooh, that's challenging. Policymakers, they are challenged, of course, by this, because it is in a way easier to work with boxes. What I think they have to do is to encourage what I called before oxymorons. They have to encourage the mixing. So they have to stress, for instance, the cultural and creative dimension of industrial transformation. one example. When we speak about robotics, when we speak about fourth industrial revolution, let's make these terminologies more dense from the cultural point of view. What does it mean to talk about the interaction between man and machine? We can't take for granted that when you mention robotics, everything is fine and beautiful just because this is the latest technology. You have to look at the impact of these technologies also from the anthropological and cultural point of view, and not for the sake of knowledge. Because if you don't do that, if you don't provide a cultural interpretation of robotics in industrial transformation, you simply lose the opportunity of being more competitive. You're less competitive because you didn't train, you didn't interpret your organization also from the cultural point of view, and you imagined that since a solution works technically, it has to work also socially.
Oh, that's nice. Let me say one thing, a small comment about that. It is that for these public policies, it is needed that the politicians accept accept the idea of ubiquity and smash the idea of boxes, don't you? Isn't it?
Yes, that's
a
challenge
for the future. It will be difficult, huh?
It is first and foremost a linguistic challenge. It's the language politics and policy speak. Yeah. I would like to live in a world in which there are less buzzwords that circulate and there's more meaning. I mean, we need words to communicate, of course, but I fear when they become something that you just repeat. You know, we've been used in the last couple of decades to these slides in which you have to mention all the relevant words, otherwise people don't qualify you as an expert. I fear a little bit that effect. So I would like, first and foremost, university professors, because we are the producers of many of those buzzwords. So, and we have to be very careful because then our users, they keep using them with little reflection. So the invitation to policymakers, both politicians and officers, is to maintain a critical distance vis-a-vis the words that we produce. This is one positive effect of the triple or quadruple helix. We should discuss and we should criticize among us.
Professor, I thank you very much. It is really challenging words from you. Thank you very much.